Well, it is lovely to be here, and very nice to see you, Alex, and very interesting presentation. And it's just been a great event to be part of altogether. And I'm like Alex, I'm very much looking forward to people's reactions and thoughts. Um, I'm going to be talking about a sort of something quite broad. So this is a framework for thinking about how normativity arises. And the idea is that it arises in a very local bottom-up way. So the thought is that human social interactions are sort of definitively about creating, negotiating agreements, momentary tacit agreements, which are about the nature of our contribution to the social interaction. This could be social interaction is a very broad term here. It could be an economic transaction. It could be a conversation. It could be anything. And the idea is that the very nature of social interactions is about this process of implicit agreement. Agreements are inherently normative. And the process of having many social interactions allows us to build up complicated patterns for the way we manage those interactions, essentially because we're creating precedents for future interactions by the past interactions, rather like the accumulation of case law. And of course, then once you have those patterns arising, you're going to get rules start to arise. You're going to have critiques of the rules, and off we go in a continual sort of ever more complicated construction of the norms of society. So that's the direction I want to go in. And this is work, I should stress, which has been going on for many years with a lot of contributors, some of whom are here. Okay, so I want to organise this discussion in four areas. The first one is joint action. We're going to do something together. How do we negotiate our plan to jointly decide to do something together? And then normativity is going to creep in straight away, because if I think the joint plan is that I pull and you push, and you don't pull, you don't push, you pull, I think you're doing it wrong. You're supposed to do this and you're doing something else. Similarly, you can criticize me. Now, we might say, oh, but that wasn't the plan. The plan was something else. And then we can disagree about what the joint plan should have been or actually was. But the very act of doing something together is this process of creating a joint plan. And as soon as you've done that, you're creating a normative standard. So that's the claim. So I'll talk a bit about joint action in a very simplified domain, talk a bit about meaning and communication. Then I'll go over that quite briefly, but it's got a fun example and simple, sort of gives a simple intuition for the approach. And then I'll talk a bit about rules and why and how they can be stable. And then I'll sort of spin out to the grander question of, can one really have a bottom-up theory of culture? And I think the answer is not completely. I mean, I'm not trying to do something quite as heroic as have a complete theory of culture here, but I want to give a sort of sense of how bottom-up theory might work. And this actually, when Cass was talking about his new book on Hayek, at the outset, this is actually quite a Hayekian perspective, although I have a very different perspective on Hayek regarding what those agreements might be. But the idea that we're creating, spontaneously creating both our own plans and plans with other people, and that society is a kind of accumulation of such things, that's quite a Hayekian Austrian economics kind of perspective. As I say, I take a rather different interpretation of what those agreements might actually reasonably be. Okay, so I'll go through this at a reasonable speed, but let's just start with the process of joint action. This is essentially jointly planning to do something together. So I'm going to give you a simple problem. I won't give you a chance to actually to solve it, but you'll find it very easy. So this is a coordination problem, and our action here is just choosing 1 or 0, and there's 11 of us. Any odd number will do. And if an odd number of us, if we add up the numbers we choose, which we have to choose separately and independently without communication, if the sum of those numbers is odd, then everybody gets a prize. And if the sum is even, nobody gets a prize. And the kind of questions that arise immediately are, well, what should we do then? And also, who should we blame? Notice that question is not, what shall I do? It's, what shall we do? And once I figured out what we should do, then I think, well, I guess my part in this is to, in this case, follow what we should do. So I suspect most of you are more immediately thinking, and it's very cognitively natural for us to think, well, obviously we're all going to choose 1, aren't we? Because that's going to be 11 ones. 11 is an odd number, so we all get a prize. If I choose 0, well, certainly taking a Kantian perspective, if we all chose 0, that would be really, really silly. I could choose randomly, but then there's only a half chance of getting a prize. So it seems like choosing 1 is a really good idea. It is worth saying that purely individualistic rational agents are stuck with this kind of problem. And one reason, and including, I think, quite a lot of AI type of agents, and the reason they're stuck, unless they're given some kind of helping hand, is that there are a lot of equilibria. So you've got 10 to the 11 possible patterns, 10 to the 10 of them are going to be successful because the 10 to the 10 way of getting odd numbers. So that means that there are basically, I say 2 to the 10. So there's essentially 1,000 or 1,024 Nash equilibria in this problem. So it's just individual rationality is not going to be very effective. What I mean by individual rationality is that I'm thinking, well, something like Nash equilibrium is what we want. So I'm trying to think of a pair of actions such that neither of us want to move from our action. But of course, there's just too many of those. This is what makes it a coordination problem. So out of the 2 to the 10 Nash equilibria, which should we choose? Well, it's sort of obvious, as I've said already. There's a really salient one, which is that we all do the same thing and we all choose one. And for that matter, if one of us chooses 0, we turn on them and say, well, you idiot, what did you do? You chose 0, everybody else chose 1. Now, from a purely, it's just a minor philosophical aside for theories of causality and responsibility attribution, from many theories in philosophy and to some extent psychology, everybody's equally to blame here, because the question is, if something goes wrong, the question is, if I had done something differently, would it have mattered? And the answer is, for each of these people, if they individually had done something differently, we'd have flipped from an even number to an odd number. So that they're all sort of equally to blame. But that's not how we see it at all. We look at the person who chose 0 and we think, well, we had a plan here. It's obvious what to do and you didn't do it. So it's your fault. And that only makes sense from a non-individualistic perspective, from the point of view that we're trying to think, what should we agree here? So I think just to hammer that point home, if we succeed by luck, we also, interestingly, turn on the people who deviate from the plan. So if 2 people say 0, then we still get our prize, but everybody else turns on them and says, what were you doing? Don't do that again. Now, according to an individualistic perspective, they might say, well, you should be thanking me. If I hadn't gone 0, none of us would have got a prize. But in fact, we don't reason like that, because we're thinking about the joint plan and the fact that the normatively right thing to do is to follow the joint plan. Of course, just an obvious but important aside, joint action problems of this kind are often not solvable. So if we have, say, 10 people, there is no magic solution. We are stuck. We just have to choose randomly, and half the time we'll succeed. There's nothing better we can do. So it's not the case that the process of finding a joint plan is always a solvable problem. But where it is, then we quite naturally do it, and we expect people to follow that plan. So the logic of this kind of problem and the unfamiliarity and strangeness of the problem is sort of deliberate, because I want to remind everybody that this is really natural for us. Even if you've never seen a problem like this before, you immediately see how to solve it. What are we doing? We're computing the agreement we could jointly make, so that if we followed it, we would succeed. And the logic requires that everyone else is making the same plan, or it won't work. So essentially, we're thinking, what should we do here? I know we're all thinking about this, so let's all do what we're supposed to do. And then we follow the recommendations. So I call this virtual bargaining. This is a process in which we imagine negotiating or bargaining. Here we don't really have conflicts of interest, but sometimes there will be. And we think what that bargain would lead to, and therefore we assume that all of us should follow the virtual bargain. I think this is such a ubiquitous process where we're just completely unaware of it, but we do it all the time. I'm not going to go into this at all, but I have the rather extreme belief that virtual bargaining is what makes social interactions social. So it's the difference between dancing with someone and bumping into them, or indeed poking them with a stick or talking to them over the radio, is that it's the mutuality, that there's a joint plan of activity. Virtual bargains are promises. This is the normative point, particularly crucial for this meeting, and why they have moral or motivational force. So because it's an agreement, though it's an implicit agreement, and I think the base of all social interactions is this notion of agreement, then if you do not follow the agreement, that's kind of the wrong thing to do, at least from the point of view of the people making the agreement. Also, of course, crucially, virtual bargains set precedents like any, both real explicit bargains and virtual bargains. So let's just apply this approach to a few cases. The one is probably least relevant to our meeting, but is nonetheless, I think, interesting, but easy to explain. And you can see the sort of charm of the approach, I hope, which is looking at meaning. Then we'll talk about rules. So this is building on work by Jennifer Misiak and based on David Lewis, Herb Clark, Thomas Schelling, and others, a long tradition in study of communication. So here we have key characters from Frozen, Anna and Elsa, and the reason I've chosen them is that they're sisters and they're on each other's side. So there's no issues of conflicts of interest or animosity, or the other regarding preferences are all positive here. They both want to help each other. And we have three objects, a nice thing, a banana, and two scorpions, which are nasty, and we're going to have a marker, which is going to help them communicate. So in the first version of the experiment, and this setup is, these are experiments we really have done in a sort of virtual reality kind of world. So I'm not going to show you those setups because they're a bit less clean, but all of the things I'm going to talk about have been done experimentally by Jennifer Misiak. So here's our first problem. So Anna, I think it is knows where the banana is. The banana is now going to disappear. The scorpions need to be avoided. The banana is just going to disappear under these buckets. And now Anna has to leave a marker somewhere for Elsa so that Elsa knows what to do. Elsa comes along. Oh, and I should point out that this first screen gives you that common knowledge. So they know there's a banana, they know there are two scorpions, they know there's a marker, and they know that they know it, and they know that they know that they know it, and all of that, the normal common knowledge story. Okay, so in this setup, Anna thinks, well, there's what would we agree here? We'd obviously agree, mark the banana. I mean, it's just that you've got a marker, and there's one banana, mark it, and that's easy. So given that Anna knows that, and Elsa knows it too, it's an easy problem to solve. Of course, there are lots of other agreements you could choose. You could say, mark the one to the left of the banana with wraparound, and that would work. And there are other crazier mappings, but it's pretty obvious that this is the natural one we would agree to. And because we know that were we to talk and discuss, we'd agree this. We don't have to talk and discuss, we just do it. That's the virtual bargaining logic. Okay, easy. But here's the cool thing. What happens if there are known to be two bananas, and now we've got one scorpion and we've got one marker, just like before? And you can potentially there's the opportunity to get two bananas here if you can work out how to do it. And of course, we can all instantly work out how to do it. And so can our participants in our experiments from trial to trial. So they do a trial like the one we just did. Then they do one of these. They just they solve it instantly, mostly anyway, almost always. So now, what does the marker mean? The marker means don't choose that one. That's where the scorpion is. So now Elsa comes along and chooses both buckets, gets both bananas. Okay, so now the meaning of that blob is flipped from being banana a moment ago to scorpion. And again, the logic is obvious. If we can imagine discussing what to do in this situation, so you know abstractly there's going to be two bananas, there's going to be one scorpion, what are we going to do? You'd say, well, I've got a marker and there's one scorpion, mark it. Then I can open the other two buckets and get both. And again, if you don't do that, people get very cross with each other. So this is the normativity point, is that if somebody doesn't follow that rule, the other person gets very irritated with them. I should point out, you might be thinking, oh, but hang on, that's really the same meaning as before because you're just pointing out the odd one out. And that is not the case. So here's just the many illustrations of this, but here's just one. Here, one person, Anna, can see that the scorpion is the odd one out, but Elsa doesn't know that. So if Anna were just blindly marking the odd one out, then she would choose the scorpion. Of course, that would be a silly thing to do because Elsa can't see the number of objects. So in that case, what actually happens, and again happens in the experiments, is that when you have a situation, there should be two bananas here, I think. Yes, there should be two bananas and one scorpion. Anna will then mark one of the bananas, and Elsa will pick up that banana. So it's only when there's common knowledge that you actually use the rule, and that makes sense because when you're thinking what would we agree, you can only think what would we agree given our common knowledge. There's no point thinking what would we agree if you magically knew something you didn't, because you can't possibly come to the same conclusion as me. If the question is what is our conclusion going to be about what to do, then it can only take account of our common knowledge. Okay, so the idea is that we're using virtual bargaining to solve this problem. We're thinking if we can see what the best convention would be, we imagine finding that agreement and just doing it. Of course, as with the first case, agreements can often fail. We do often need to communicate in sequence and we make mistakes in repair and so on. Some quick extrapolations of this case. I think that this process of virtual bargaining in communication is what distinguishes communication in some human-like sense from mere signaling. So something like antelopes bouncing up and down to tell lions that they're fit and healthy and therefore not worth chasing. That's an informational connection in the sort of Claude Shannon information theory sense. But humans are doing something really different. When humans are communicating, they're collaboratively creating these momentary conventions. And the joint understanding of those conventions is what's driving their behavior. So I think that's a fundamental distinction. It could be that this is a crucial aspect of human communication, why humans are really good virtual bargainers, and we don't see any sign of this process in non-human animals, although that's not completely straightforward, and it's not my area, but at least humans are really good at it compared to other animals. Whether it's unique to humans is another question. And it is also the case that humans are uniquely linguistic, and that may be relevant. The precedence point also applies especially to language, because when you create a communicative convention, then that communicative convention can get reused and built on. And indeed, Morton Christensen at Cornell and I have been thinking about this for a long time, and we have a book on this called The Language Game, which is essentially a theory of how languages evolve from scratch using this kind of mechanism. Okay, I just want to say a tiny bit about why societies don't collapse. Now we're going to talk about rules and then just some sort of generalizations, and I'll stop. I hope I'm doing okay for time. So the puzzle I want to ask you about, and this is my example of rules, is a puzzle that was inspired by a discussion with Bob Sugden, who's essentially, this is his example, but I've just transmuted it into a slightly different setup. So on a lonely road, a driver D stops for fuel at a remote filling station with attendant A. No one's watching them. There's no police. There's no records. No cameras. Now, is a transaction possible here? Well, maybe it's difficult, but anyway, we feel intuitively, I think, that it might be possible that they can actually have a mutually beneficial transaction. But suppose D pays for some gas. Does A actually provide any? Or if A provides the gas, does D actually pay? How is it possible if no one's observing us? And I think there are sort of two cases to consider here, and they both lead to trouble. There's a symmetrical case where we're both equally powerful creatures. So imagine we're both armed, or we're both crocodiles, or we both have the same degree of physical power, or have some other indirect way of overpowering the other. So in this case, then the possibility of some kind of conflict between us is really bad for both of us, because we're roughly symmetrical. So this means that a forward-looking agent wondering whether or not to whether it's worth engaging in conflict will tend to almost think no. So, for example, if I pay for the gas and I don't get any gas, you might think, well, I'm going to be really cross. I'm going to confront the other person. But actually, in the symmetrical case, I should think, well, that's not a good idea, because there might be a fight, and the fight's really bad for both of us. But it's certainly bad for me. If I didn't get any gas and now I get injured or killed, that's even worse. The other possibility is the asymmetrical case. I'm clearly simplifying a bit here. This is a crocodile versus koala case. And here, conflict is totally fine for the crocodile, because it's not going to be hurt by the koala. But the trouble is, we still can't get an interaction going, because the crocodile will just take the gas and not pay for it. Or force the koala and give over its money and not give it any gas. So once you've got that kind of asymmetry, but clearly a mutually beneficial bargain doesn't happen either. So either way, you don't get a mutually beneficial transaction. So you might think, but reputation might help us here, because if D, perhaps D, the driver, pays, because if the driver doesn't pay, A will complain to everybody else about D's behavior. But the trouble is that a forward-looking agent who only cares about their own well-being will complain or not, depending on what the welfare benefits will be for them in the future. And that will not depend on whether or not they actually got cheated on. So if it pays me to complain, I'll complain. If it doesn't pay me to complain, I won't complain. But it doesn't carry any information about what actually happened to me. So it doesn't really give an incentive to the person to treat me well, because the complaint behavior carries no information. It's just cheap talk. So that doesn't help. And you can generalize this kind of issue, this kind of problem. I won't go into this in great detail, but imagine you think, what we need is police. So we have the attendant and the driver, but luckily there's a policeman standing by watching the whole thing. But then you have the problem that if the police are rational agents, They'll be maximizing their utility, not imposing in rules or anything. They'll just be individualistic and maximizing agents. So they'll punish or intervene if punishment is in their interest, but not otherwise. And so, in fact, we have another set of problems there, which is essentially a kind of the corruption of the rational agent. I won't go into this in great detail, but essentially, unless you have unless you have police who are meta police who are watching the first lot of police and meta police, the whole thing is unstable, and this tower can't go on forever. So the problem is that if you're dealing with the world with purely rational, self-interested agents, all they're interested in is maximizing utilities. They're not interested in following rules. Now, we intuitively think, well, hang on, there's a kind of deal to be had here. I give you some gas, you give me some money. That's kind of what we're supposed to do. That's the virtual bargain. It's a kind of naturally intuitive thing. It seems reasonable. We both agree it is a reasonable thing to do. Let's just do it. And in fact, we don't just think that. We also think, and indeed, if you don't do it, you should be punished. So it's legitimate for me to confront you in fact, I should confront you if you try and cheat me. That's also part of the bargain. So what we need is some kind of social contract, obviously familiar from Hobbes, Rousseau, Rawls, and so on. But we need a social contract just for this tiny little interaction. This is where my bottom-up stance comes in. So the idea is that what virtual bargaining really is doing is creating a miniature social contract. It says, instead of providing an agreement to govern the whole of society like the conventional social contract of Hobbes, Rousseau, and Rawls, it's an implicit agreement to govern this specific interaction. But it does include rights and responsibilities. So I've got the right to the gas once I paid, and you've got a responsibility to give me the gas once I've given you the money, and so on and so on. We've got roles. You're the gas person, I'm the money person. And the contract is operative if we would agree to it, just as a contract, social contract, is legitimate if it's supported by its citizens. So, okay, yes, I just want to say one extrapolation here, which I think is fun, which is this perspective, I think, explains why it's wrong to be angry with a shark. So this is a moral emotion point. I think a lot of moral emotions are actually about virtual bargains and their violation. So it's our sense that there is an agreement that we should be following here, and somebody's violated it. So I can fear a shark quite legitimately, but I can't be angry with a shark, or at least if I do, it's a mistake. And the reason is that if a shark bites me, it never agreed not to. So it's just nonsense to be angry with a shark, because if it was a human who bit me, I would be angry, because I think, well, there's either an implicit or maybe even an actual agreement, no biting, and you bit me. That's terrible. We all agree that's bad, but the shark never made an agreement. So being angry at the shark is a kind of fundamental sort of conceptual mistake. Anyway, quick bit about normativity in culture at large. How does the social contract grow? So Morton, my aforementioned friend Morton Christensen, and I have a paper just coming out in Behavioural and Brain Sciences in the next few months or something, called Social Tinkering, and that's really the topic here. I'll be very brief on this. The social contract, as Hobbes, Rousseau, Rawls in a different way considered it, is big and complicated, and it has all these norms and conventions and customs and laws and rights and who knows, institutions, organizations, governments. And the question is, well, where does this come from? And the thought from this perspective is that it accumulates bottom up through innovation and precedent. So culture is the accretion essentially of case law. I should just quickly say it's not, from this point of view, variation and selection using the classical analogy with biology. I think that's really the wrong angle. Morton, in my view, would be the point about agreements is they're deliberate. They are engaging. They're coming from intelligent agents, using forward-looking reasoning to try and solve the problem in front of them. So this is not a standard biological evolution, cultural evolution story. Okay, so the basic unit is precedent. Each virtual bargain takes place on the basis of previous virtual bargains, and the complexity of these things will gradually accumulate. The image to have, at least I like, is the coral reef, where each polyp just builds on the last polyp, but you get this enormously complicated structure. And I think that's one story about where we can get language, customs, conventions. At each point, we're just trying to solve the problem of the moment. With some bad things happening, we introduce a rule to stop it, but then that has some nasty side effects. We plug the loophole, and then we need someone to enforce the rules. So we start to empower someone to be a policeman or a judge, and so on and so on. Complexity just accumulates gradually. And a final obvious point, but perhaps an interesting one, is that from this point of view, you can see explicit cultural forms, things like actual laws, rules of football, constitutions of companies and so on, financial systems and money, as codifications of what were once virtual bargains. So the idea is that once upon a time, football was a very informal activity, or soccer, where people just kicked balls around in a fairly chaotic fashion. But then gradually, rules get imposed to make the thing less violent, and so we can agree how big the goal is and what counts as winning and when the game stops. And because we have to figure all this stuff out, before we know it, we've written down a hugely complicated set of rules. And I think the legal system is sort of a tiny fraction of our informal virtual bargaining is actually codified in the legal and regulatory documents. So we're forced to make virtual bargains explicit when there are disputes, but we can never make bargains entirely explicit. This is the open-ended nature of the law. So the thought here, this is Adam Ferguson's idea, which is the source of Morton and my paper, and I think also was a big Hayek inspiration, is that norms, institutions, and organizations, the world and the normative world generally, are the product of human action, but not human design. So they're not random variation. They're deliberately created to solve the problem of the moment, but they're not. But the cumulative effect is to create a system which wasn't really designed by people. It's just emerged. So the idea is that you need to have an incremental theory of culture as layers of improvised virtual agreements based on precedents, and principles of spontaneous order in a Hayekian or Bob Sugden type sense will lead you to the complex systems we see. Okay, so just to summarize that, this is a perspective on where normativity comes from, where you start with joint action, where we agree what to do. We have agreements about meanings to allow us to communicate. Once we've got communication, we can start to agree social contracts of a more concrete nature, but we do that in a bottom-up way. And culture itself is a layering of agreements and making them explicit. Okay, with that, I shall stop sharing and be very happy to take any hear comments and reflections.